we're bound to go on faithfully carrying forward the witness of the church through time, and that we are somehow mystically united, right, to the church triumphant and accountable to that witness in the way that we conduct ourselves in the here and now.
And so confessionalism, in that sense, is at least a way of saying that we're not just remaking our identity out of nothing at every moment, but we're living into this continuity that we have.
Welcome to Cardigan and Collar. My name is David Louie, and I teach theology here at the North American Lutheran Seminary, which is centered in Ambridge, Pennsylvania. I'll be joined here in a moment, as usual, by my co-host, Pastor Maurice Lee, who serves at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Abington, Pennsylvania. It's an exciting moment for Cardigan and Collar. In addition to a new season, we're also pivoting to a new format. In addition to our audio episodes, we're also making our conversations available in a video format, which you can find on YouTube and other platforms as well. As for our new season, we are asking big and deep questions about the nature of confessional theology. We want to think about what exactly does it mean for a church or for a pastor or for Christians to be confessional. We want to reflect on what are our confessions ultimately for. And the guiding theme inspired by our clergy retreat from last year is that the confessions, among other things, function as a way into riches. They lead us into the riches of God. They guide us into the riches of Holy Scripture. They introduce us to the riches of the church's vast tradition. And most especially, they guide us to the riches of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and his gospel. We've had a great time talking to our presenters from the clergy retreat last year, and we hope you'll enjoy listening in. With that, let's tune in to episode 1. Pastor Maurice, could you tell our listeners a bit more about what it is that we're focusing on for this season of the podcast?
Yeah. In 2025, which in some ways seems like a long time ago as we're recording, the North American Lutheran Church hosted its annual pastors retreat. And this is early in the year, every year, the entire ministerium, all the ordained people and associate spouses and others are invited to gather and to, just as the name says, to retreat. There's usually a theme for the gathering, and in 2025 the theme was generous confessionalism. I wasn't part of the planning team for that. You were, David, but I was a grateful participant in the entire retreat, which included talks, small groups, all sorts of time to free time and so forth. But it was the 4 lectures or talks that we're concentrating in this season. The talks are devoted to the topic of generous confessionalism, each from a different perspective. So we had you, David, leading off the series in terms of talking about confessions as a way into riches, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss what that means. We had our colleague, the Reverend Dr. Ori McFarland, who is a pastor in Oklahoma, speaking about confessions and their relationship to Scripture. We had your colleague, Dr. Alex Pierce, here at the seminary, speaking on confessions and their relation to the Christian tradition. And then we had the Reverend Laura Bassin, who pastors at Emmanuel Lutheran in New York City, speaking about confessions and their relationship to culture. So a really wide range of really interesting topics, rich and in just thought-provoking enough that we thought that it would be worthwhile getting them into the studio, so to speak, and speaking with them further about these things.
Yeah, it's funny. I won't speak to my own presentation, of course, but as I was at the retreat, listening to these papers, I found each of the other presentations to be incredibly rich. And it was one of those things where it felt like I wish we had more time than is available to explore all of the different implications and different angles from which the presenters were discussing our topic. So I'm grateful that we were kind of creating a bit more space through this venue to kind of squeeze a little more out of those very rich presentations that we got to listen to during the retreat itself.
I mean, there's a way in which you hope that any theological presentation, be it a paper at a conference or a sermon or a talk like this, is, I mean, because of the very subject matter, it's hopefully it'll produce and spark off continued conversation. But with you, I thought that these talks were particularly worthy of kind of following in that way, and because the thoughts that they started running, in my mind at least, were just, they were going all over the place. And so it's what an opportunity and a privilege to be able to talk further with the speakers about these things.
Yeah, as I was listening back to the presentations, I also got a chuckle out of Pastor McFarland's challenge that he issued to the audience, where he said, "I'm happy to chat about this more if you can catch me," right? Because it's so. But
didn't he say we needed to give him a 2-minute head start? Something.
Yeah. And he commented on he's pretty fast. So, and so in a sense, you could view this season of our podcast as challenge accepted.
That's
right. So at some point he'll be pinned down, not here in the studio,
Flying
probably.
leap, yeah.
But in any case, no, I'm excited for these conversations. Part of the purpose of the retreat was to ask the question, what kind of confessionalism are we seeking to practice and to live into as a church body? But I thought maybe it would be good to start by asking a more fundamental question, which is, what is confessionalism? What exactly is this thing? It's a common term for Lutherans, and some other Christian traditions also use that term confessionalism. But when you hear the term confessionalism, I guess a very basic question, what is that, as you understand it?
Right. And it's very interesting because you say that there are a variety of Christians who use that or who are familiar with that. I grew up in a tradition where that wasn't a familiar term, either confessional or confessionalism. And even the word confession wasn't, except in terms of the colloquial meaning of confessing our sins. So it wasn't really familiar. So as I became more familiar with it, I realized that there are different ways in which this word family is used, right? We talk about confession, and not only confession of sins, but confessions as in confessing the faith.
Yep.
Of course, there's a deep biblical basis for that. But we also talk about confessionalism, which that's our topic. And then as you learn more about the history of the church, you hear about things like confessionalization, which is sometimes used to talk about the ways in which different groups, particularly in the 16th century, but other times as well, separated themselves from one another, made themselves distinct from one another. And so there's all sorts of ways in which this word family is used. And so I think it's worth it to ask, well, when we talk about confessionalism, what are we talking about? And as a first pass, I think at the least, we're saying that there's a certain relationship that we're claiming to have, that we feel that we've been put into with particular documents, texts that we call confessions. And those themselves are called confessions because they are instances of, their instantiations of, in some sense, confessing the faith. There's a real interesting question, I think, and worth pursuing what kind of relationship that is that we're talking about. Right?
Yeah. I was thinking about this verb family. It's it's actually a noun and a verb, and other different kinds of word types as well. This word family, and you could think of it in terms of tenses as well. Like there's a kind of past tense indexing to that.
Okay.
These are documents that have been produced. They exist now in the world as artifacts of a past situation.
And that reminds me of, for example, is it in 1 Timothy where Paul says, Jesus who made the good confession before Pontius Pilate, right? There's a certain past, something fixed about that.
It's a coordinate within the world into which we are born, right? And in which we now stand. But of course, confession is also a present tense verb. It's something that Christians are called upon to do in various ways in the here and now. But then also, eschatologically, there's this notion of like standing before God, the kind of confessing before God. We're confessing now, but we're also hoping to be living in the direction of being more and more drawn into faithfully the good confession of Jesus Christ.
Every knee will bow, every tongue confess.
Exactly. And so I was thinking about that in terms of like, where would I start with, what is confessionalism? And in some ways,
it's a whole different dimension, this time dimension.
But isn't it a way of sort of saying, we think that the present tense mode of confessing and the future tense mode of confessing have something to do with the past tense,
Yeah,
right? That we think
right.
part of what it is to faithfully confess now and part of what it is to be guided faithfully towards confessing before Christ on the last day. We stand in a certain kind of relationship to the saints who have come before us. We are walking in their example. We are, in some sense, obliged by the theological judgments that they have passed on. Guard the good deposit. This notion from Paul to Timothy as well. And so I don't want to get too philosophical about this, but there's a sense that, like, confessionalism has to do somehow with like relating the present and future dimensions of confession with the past. That those things are some kind of seamless garment, or at the very least that there are normative relationships between those that we think are very, very important.
Yes, I think that's very significant. We don't simply have it before us to go in whatever direction just suits our fancy at the moment. We're not whatever arbitrary kind of desire we have now. There's a responsibility that we have. There's a sort of boundedness that we have to these claims, these confessions of the past.
Yeah, it's
shape us.
I have a friend who talks about like the burden of, in his case, he says the burden of Catholicity, which burden has a negative connotation in some ways, but it's a way of saying to accept a confession is to accept a responsibility of some kind. It actually asks something of you.
Yeah.
Right. It's not, as you say, you're not just free to invent or to carry forward the Christian faith in whatever direction seems best to your individual autonomous discernment or the individual autonomous discernment of a particular parochial church or church body at a particular time in history. There's a burden of that. There's a yoke. We're bound to go on faithfully carrying forward the witness of the church through time, and that we are somehow mystically united, right, to the church triumphant and accountable to that witness in the way that we conduct ourselves in the here and now.
And so confessionalism in that sense is at least a way of saying that we're not just remaking our identity out of nothing at every moment, but we're living into this continuity that we have, the way in which this particular thread of the past has shaped us and gives us some sense of where we're moving.
Yes. It's funny, I hadn't thought of this before this conversation. Isn't this aren't we kind of getting close to a reason why, for moderns in particular, confessionalism, there's a kind of friction to that notion?
Yes.
The notion that somehow I'm indebted to, I'm burdened by, I'm constrained by these decisions, these judgments that have been made apart from my consent, upstream of my agency.
I'm not free to make up my own mind kind of thing. Yeah.
We are born into a world that has a certain structure, and the confessions, in a sense, like before I have my first conscious thought, are kind of placing me somewhere. They're placing me before God. They're placing me in relations of accountability to members of a body, right? And especially when you couple this with a doctrine of infant baptism, as Lutherans, we hold to that. There's a lot that, like, before I am aware of it, there is this, what can be experienced as a burden in the negative sense. I'm burdened with all of this baggage, so to speak. And I think there's something in the modern psyche that sits very ill at ease with how we like to think of ourselves.
Well, whether you consciously adhere to some defined Christian confession or not, that's just the way that's the way human life is. None of us can simply invent ourselves completely out of the blue, and so we're going to be shaped. We're going to be stuck in something, to abuse philosophical language that was first used in another way. We're thrown into this situation.
Yeah.
And so being confessional is a way of admitting, of kind of particularizing. This is, I'm acknowledging this. It's a certain form of honesty and integrity, I think.
And in that sense, confessionalism starts to feel a bit more like a gift, right? The gift of, almost in a sense, the world, this confusing world into which you're thrown, you kind of need someone to come along and help you find your bearings and make sense of the world, right? And so one way to think about the confessions is it's sort of like a, let me help acclimate you to reality, the reality in which you are enmeshed, a world you did not create, a world that in some sense is not really subject to negotiation. It reminds me of some of the Psalms, like Psalm 100 or Psalm 95, where God addresses, in the voice of the Psalter, God addresses his people and says, I am your God and you are my people. I have created you. You are the sheep of my pasture. There's sort of a sense of like, you could experience that as God kind of putting us in our place. And I don't think that would be wrong. There's an element of that. But there's also an element of God giving us place. This is who you are, right? This is the gift of clarity, of knowing who you are and what you're here for is also a gift. And so that term burden can sort of veer in either direction, it seems to me. And the confessions are sort of an instrument of that. They're somehow related to that witness of the church to her members to say, here's the kind of creature you are. Here's the kind of world in which you live.
Right. And in that sense, it's an extension just of the gift of existence. To be a creature at all is to be given a life and a place in the world that God has made. And so what you're saying is that the gift continues in God giving us knowledge of and understanding of and a chance to live into what we were made to be and what that means for our relationship to God and for our relationship to the world.
Didn't Pastor Laura and Pastor Ori both kind of touch upon this when they were reflecting on their journey into Lutheranism? That I don't want to put words into their mouth, but if I'm remembering from their lecture, they said something like they were reflecting on a season of life where they felt confused.
Yes, right.
And the experience of reading the Lutheran Confessions was like, oh, this is somehow speaking in a diagnostic way of something that I've been kind of fumbling my way around. These agitations of soul, or sort of kind of trying to find my bearings in the world. And so it wasn't, in other words, the tone of it was not this kind of extraneous, extrinsic, arbitrary word of, let me kind of put you in your place. It was the gift of kind of making sense of a dynamic of Christian experience or a dynamic of experience in general. It was what actually proved to be the magnetic factor in leading them into Lutheran confessional identity. I thought that was really fascinating.
I think you're right. Ori, I'm pretty sure Ori used, and I hope we get a chance to talk with him about this, used the image of being exegeted, of being interpreted.
That's exactly,
by the confessions, by God through the confessions. And you talk about his life becoming more and more making sense to him in that way. And I think I think Laura, although she might not have used that exact language, also gave that sense of having questions answered and things becoming clear by way of the confessions. Not some sort of extrinsicist force coming in and completely making us something different from what we were supposed to be, but quite the opposite.
Isn't that seems like people talk about a vibe shift occurring, in our contemporary moment, however we might describe that moment.
Right.
And, is it perhaps this like desire to be exegeted somehow related to that? I mean,
interesting.
There were earlier moments in modernity. We use these terms obviously with the asterisk, recognizing that they're, these are complex phenomena we're trying to describe. There were more optimistic moments in the history of the modern world, where the vibe was not that I need someone to exegete me. We felt, I think, as a human race, at least in the West, confident of our ability to not just exegete reality, but kind of almost, conjure up the reality that we desire. That these instruments of technology, these, the spread of information technology, the rise of democracy, like whatever it might be, there's a kind of story of, I don't need to be exegeted. You know what I mean? We have, with enough ingenuity and with enough time and enough, semiconductors, we can create the world that we want. that is not the vibe that I'm sensing now. There's a
right.
desire to be exegeted. Like, what is this world? What is this? What is it that I'm experiencing? I need this to be made sense of.
Right.
And so, I don't know. Maybe the time is ripe.
Could be.
But I think a rediscovery of confessionalism.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right that this project of creating our own meaning, of striking out on our own and saying, well, I'm just gonna, I can't figure out, the universe isn't telling me what I'm supposed to be doing, so I'm just going to kind of make my own reality and forge my own truth and create my own meaning. That has, I think more and more people are seeing that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. The chaos and the loss of community and the violence, there's a deep connection between those forms of disorder and loss of significance and our inability to create our own meaning. And so maybe you're right that there's a door open for, at least for pointing at the confessions and saying there's a guide here. There's something.
So are we suggesting here, and of course not a comprehensive definition, but it sounds to me like we're saying confessionalism is something like an acceptance of the gift of being given place, or something like that. There's got to be a clearer way to say that. But confessionalism at its root, there's a lot of elements to it, has to do with the receiving of the gift of being placed in the world by God, and placed in the world by a company of those who have gone before us. This is somehow like there's a kernel. Yeah. That's somehow like the kernel of what it is to go on in a confessional way.
I love that. I think that the relationship between the confessions and living in a confessional way, being confessional, part of a confessionalism, to describe that as somehow related to receiving a gift is very significant, I think.
Yeah. Counterintuitive to the modern,
for sure,
to the modern instinct, but somehow paradoxically also timely.
And one of the things it implies is, I talked before about this idea of or this term confessionalization as being sort of continually distinguishing oneself or separating oneself from other Christians. But if confessionalism, in the way that we're describing it, has any purchase, that means that there's a way in which we're being brought together. It's not simply that by being related to documents, a certain set of documents that for us Lutherans, we'll call it the Book of Concord, the Lutheran Confessions. That's not separating us from the rest of the great stream of Christianity and the riches of the whole Christian tradition, but is instead turning us toward that and giving us, you talk about giving us place. There's a certain place that we have, but it's in relation to all these other,
Yeah, that's a theme I think that's going to come out in a lot of the conversations we have. The place in which confessionalism grounds us is the expansive place of the Catholic and Apostolic faith. And so, there's another paradox there, that confessionalization at times played out in the form of amplifying differences among Christians. And, at particular moments in history, that may be a necessary element of sort of upholding confessional identity. But, at least for the Lutheran confessions, and I think it's broadly true of other confessions as well, I mean, our confession, the cardinal document, at least of the Lutheran theological reform, is the Augsburg Confession. And the tone and posture of that is very much like, we are not innovators. We are not cutting ourselves off from, we are not ceding the inheritance of the great Christian tradition to our opponents, right? And so paradoxically, keep using that word, but I think it does apply. Years later now, it's what began as one of the chief documents that was responsible for the institutional division of the church is sort of also now a document which has the function of making necessary our ongoing relationship with other church bodies.
Right.
Because it sort of is directing us towards the Christian tradition that we share. So that's a fascinating tension, I think.
And it seems to me you could describe it in a bunch of ways: genius, providence, fundamentally, maybe other ways to describe it, to say that as you point out, the first half of the Augsburg Confession is all about the Catholicity of this movement. We're not minded to invent anything new. In fact, the ways in which even Article 4 on justification claims a deep and unbreakable continuity with the stream of Christian tradition. And so that half of the Augsburg Confession has first in the Augsburg Confession and has retained its place in the set of our confessions is, I think, extremely significant, thought-provoking, and should really make us pause to wonder, what does being confessional mean in relation to the rest of Christianity?
Yeah, agreed. So now that all of our listeners, without exception, want to be confessional,
Of course.
let's talk a bit more about what it is to be generously confessional. And
Yes.
let's this modifier generous, what's your perception of kind of what's going on there? You mentioned you weren't part of the planning, but just as someone who
Right.
participated in the conference, what do you think is the significance of that, and why might this be a good, something that is sort of worthwhile to continue discussing, sort of this notion of generous confessionalism?
Right. And I think it's really interesting because I'm sure those of you who are planning this were aware that this word generous has been used over the last some decades to refer to, well, it's been used in various ways, but often to talk about a way of Christianity, a way of living Christianly, a way of thinking Christianly that isn't simply kind of turned in on itself, sort of wanting to hunker down and carve out its own little niche or its own little kind of refuge.
Yeah.
But in some way that looks outward, that is open, that is welcoming. And I think that there are a lot of good things about thinking in that way. But as we'll find out, particularly your talk, one can only be generous in the sense of opening oneself up and welcoming others into what one has when one has already been the recipient of and the enjoyer of a generosity that isn't just generated by ourselves.
Sure.
And you particularly point that out in your talk, that it's the generosity of the fullness, the infinite abundance of God that starts this chain going. Yeah. And so to talk about generous confessionalism in the way that we're going to be doing, following up on the retreat, is, I think, to bring this out into the open, to say, well, we can only be generous in whatever way we're allowed to be generous because God has been generous to us.
Yes. Yeah. I like that. Yeah. That it reminds me of a similar ambiguity, tension in the word hospitality.
Yeah, right.
That there's a sort of postmodern notion of hospitality where you just it sort of is incompatible with owning anything.
Right.
But actually, if you think about the notion of hospitality, it presupposes that you have something that is recognizably yours.
Yeah.
And yet it's something into which you are inviting others. And so there's something of that duality. I think you could imagine both ways of defining generosity as well. Like, sure, generosity might be misconstrued as incompatible with protecting a deposit of faith and upholding the borders of orthodoxy or something like that. To be generous would be to just sort of, let be, not sort of kind of give up on this notion of a theological tradition that does pose constraints upon you or place burdens upon you,
right,
as we were talking about in the first half of the conversation. But I think, like the term hospitality, and this is what I'm taking from your comment, generosity actually presupposes at its core that there is a deposit. Mm-hmm. There's a deep and wide deposit that is yes, being guarded, right? Its integrity needs to be something that we are attentively upholding and maintaining. But the nature of the thing that we are upholding and seeking to protect from corruptions and so forth is precisely this kind of broad and vast and yes, generous reality that calls for a kind of outward dispositional posture of sort of, we have this so as to share it, so as to invite others into this capacious space. Right. So that's interesting how those two terms are subject to a similar kind of postmodern, what's the word I'm looking for? A misalignment or redefinition.
Yeah.
It seems to me
Yeah.
that's interesting.
I think you're bringing up the parallel of hospitality and welcome that's thought provoking by itself. We can only welcome into what we ourselves have been welcomed into. We can't just make it up on our own.
Yep.
And of course, I'm using the language of Romans, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. But it's Christ who does that first. And Christ has done that in a particular way, out of abundance for sure, but in a way that doesn't allow us just to say, oh, well, I can just remake this house into whatever I want in order that other people can come in and do the same. That's not what's going on here.
Yeah, so maybe this dual valence of generosity and hospitality could be an interesting way to kind of hang on to these concepts, that sort of maintaining that balance. Our seminary president, Jukka Karjainen, sometimes uses that phrase of hospitable confessionalism.
Yes.
But then you have the same question of like, well, what exactly is this getting at? Because hospitality can evoke connotations that are not really intended here. So, yeah, in either case, it's important to kind of clarify that.
But I guess on the other side, and you bring this up in your talk, we'll talk about this more when we discuss it with you, the idea of generosity is, in a sense, it's pushing back against a notion of confessionalism that imagines, maybe not without expressing it, but imagines, well, I've got it. I don't have to, I'm good. Don't have to share this. Don't have to discuss this. Don't have to be open about this with others.
Just guard the fence line and your job is done.
And so that's what generous confessionalism, I would hope that we end up thinking that generous is in a way redundant. That confessionalism in itself is a way of being open to relating to others. But for the time being, we want to say we're also trying to exclude a kind of misunderstanding.
Yes. Yeah. And it's probably important to say, after I was looking back at the presentations and mine in particular, there's another potential misunderstanding that might be useful to kind of name. And that is, the goal of the exercise is not to say, hey, we're not like these other sorts of confessionalists. Yeah. I think the better way to think about it is ingredient to confessionalism. If you are seeking to be a confessional Christian of any kind, ingredient to that are all of these different aspects of what it is to be faithfully confessional. All these different, you could almost think like, not to get too, technical about it, but almost like distinct operations that are sort of within, that are incumbent upon you in the maintenance of a confessional identity. And I think what we're saying is that there has to be a kind of order of operations. There has to be a kind of hierarchy where not to the displacement of any. So to put it more concretely, the defense of the faith is part of confessionalism. It's one of these operations of confessionalism. You have to guard the fence. You won't have, in the same way that a hospitality which doesn't maintain distinction of ownership quickly is no longer coherently, hospitality is no longer possible under those conditions. So also, there is no such thing as a confessionalism with integrity that does not involve what I just referred to metaphorically is like guarding the fence, maintaining the border between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. So the goal of this exercise is not to say we're not like those confessionalists who are all about, fence guarding. What we're trying to say is that within the act of seeking to be confessional, you're going to find it necessary to attend to all of these different elements of confessional church life. We're trying to reflect upon how those operations can sort of maintain appropriate place and order so that what we were talking about in the first half of our conversation isn't misdirected. This kind of past, present, future orientation of confessing isn't interrupted by one of these operations kind of achieving the driver's seat in relation to the others.
Another way to put it would be that there's something, a deposit to be defended.
Yes.
And to put too much attention, to put overweening or disproportionate attention on the fence and on maintaining the fence, at least runs the risk of not paying enough attention to and not enjoying and delighting in so that it can be shared.
Yes.
The content, the deposit, what's inside.
Yeah, that's right. You're always. It's almost a matter of your postural orientation. Is confessionalism primarily a way of being attentive to threats, or is confessionalism primarily a way of being attentive to the one whom we seek to confess? And this is not an either or, right? This is the point I'm trying to get at here, is that it's both. You're attending to these and indeed other things. I think confessionalism involves disciplines of attention would be one way to think about it. You're accepting certain disciplines of attention. I think what we're trying to sort of think through is how do you make sure that the principal object of attention is the God whom we confess, who is the great, the unsearchably vast source of all that is good, all that we receive, all that we have, all that we are, and of the very salvation that is ours through Jesus Christ. That needs to somehow be the principal focus of attention, I think, is what we want to contend through these talks and our conversations.
And as you put it, the confessionalism then is a sort of discipline of having the right priority of attention.
Yeah.
In other words, attending to first things first. And then, of course, others as a result of that, as needed.
Right.
But not forgetting that there's a hugeness, a vastness that takes our primary attention.
Yeah, so I'm really excited for these conversations. Listening back to the talks, there's so many, I think we're going to find it hard as usual to be disciplined in terms of time constraints and staying on topic. Hopefully that's not too annoying to the listeners. But to our listeners, we invite you to join us in these conversations. This is something that we think is worthwhile for our church body as members of the NALC. If you're not members of the NALC, you're welcome to come along with us on this journey of conversation. And as always, if you find the conversations helpful, we would ask you to subscribe, hit like, send the links to your friends. We love to hear from our listeners. We're trying to cultivate what we hope is going to be an enriching conversation about a very important topic that's of momentous significance for our church body and indeed for the life of any church body. So any last thing you want to say to our listener before we embark?
I'm so excited about the season. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, thanks so much for listening in, and goodbye for now.
Cardigan Collar is a podcast of the North American Lutheran Seminary. It is hosted by Dr. David Louie and the Reverend Dr. Maurice Lee. This podcast is produced by Emily Clark and Stephen Neaton, and the theme music is performed by Mary Van Hooser. To learn more information about the North American Lutheran Seminary, visit the NALS.org.